war grinds on. In the mud of the trenches, faces shape themselves into snapshots of exhaustion and resolve. Cities fall silent under smoke. Messages crackle through radios.
The dates are etched into the memory of civilization. August 6th and August 9th, 1945. The fires have been extinguished, the smoke has cleared, and the debris has settled. The world stands silent, stunned not by the sheer scale of the victory that ended World War II, but by the blinding, terrifying light that delivered it. Hiroshima and Nagasaki are no longer cities. They are grim radioactive monuments to a power that defies imagination. The atomic age had begun. Nations were stunned into paralysis. The people who built the bombs, the scientists, the engineers, were haunted. They had delivered peace, yes, but at a price too high to comprehend. They had opened a door that could never be closed. Suddenly, the global order was rewritten. The United States, the architect of this terrible technology, stood alone. It was the world's only nation possessing the weapon that could annihilate a city in a single flash. For a fleeting moment, America possessed ultimate, unchallenged power.
But the triumph of 1945 was merely a deceptive lull. Victory did not bring an end to conflict. It simply changed the rules. The alliance that had crushed the Axis powers was already fracturing along ideological fault lines. Capitalism versus communism. The weapon that had ended the Great War now served as the catalyst for the next one. A war fought not with bombs and boots, but with shadows, secrets, and the constant, chilling threat of global annihilation. A war of nerves, ideology, and atomic brinksmanship, the Cold War.
In destroying one enemy, humanity had unlocked its greatest one, itself.
The Cold War was a conflict waged not just on political maps, but in the deepest shadows of hidden science. For the American scientific community, the work at facilities like Los Alamos didn't stop with victory. Now, their mission was defense, to understand the power they had unleashed, and to maintain the atomic monopoly that guaranteed America's security. They continued to refine, to test, and to analyze, but the atmosphere was fundamentally changed. The initial camaraderie of shared purpose was slowly being corroded by an intense, corrosive paranoia. The reason was simple. They knew the physics of the atom couldn't be kept secret forever. Across the globe, the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, was moving with a desperate, ruthless speed. They viewed the American atomic monopoly as an existential threat. They were not waiting for their own scientists to figure it out. They sent in their spies. The story of the Cold War's nuclear balance is inextricably linked to names like Klaus Fuchs. Fuchs, a brilliant German-born physicist who had worked inside the Manhattan Project, was a committed Soviet sympathizer. He systematically passed precise, detailed blueprints, mathematical calculations, and key component information directly to Moscow. He was joined by others, most famously the American couple Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. While their involvement remains debated by historians, they were part of a vast espionage network that funneled classified information from American laboratories to Soviet agents. The world's most dangerous secrets were exchanged in the quiet tension of alleyways in New York City, through coded telegrams relayed across continents, and in clandestine meetings where every quiet footstep was a potential exposure. The stakes were astronomical, the balance of global power. As the Soviets made rapid, unexplained progress on their own bomb, the U.S. government became frantic. Security tightened around every defense installation. Suspicion became the air everyone breathed. Scientists who had once been hailed as heroes now found themselves under the microscope. The race for technological superiority had transformed into a global hunt for traitors. In this climate of deepening distrust, the United States knew it was only a matter of time before the nuclear playing field would be leveled. The question wasn't if the Soviets would acquire the bomb, but when, and how much help they had already received from the enemy within.
Over the barren plains of Kazakhstan, a column of fire and ash claws into the sky. The first Soviet atomic test, Joe-1, erupts with a force that...
For 4 agonizing years, the United States had enjoyed a brief, terrifying supremacy. That dominance ended on August 29, 1949. Deep in the remote steppes of Kazakhstan, the Soviet Union conducted its first successful atomic test. Codenamed First Lightning by the Soviets and known to the West as Joe-1, the successful detonation shocked the world. It was a catastrophic strategic failure for American intelligence and security. The atomic monopoly was over. The news landed in Washington, D.C. like a seismic shockwave. President Harry S. Truman publicly announced that the balance of power had fundamentally shifted, confirming that an atomic explosion had occurred in the Soviet Union. The arms race, a deadly competition for the planet's ultimate weapons, had officially begun. The implications were immediately felt not in far-off battlefields, but in the homes and schools of America. The Soviet bomb transformed the distant threat of communism into a terrifying, immediate danger. If the Soviets had the bomb, America could be hit. Citizens lived under a cloud of existential fear. The government responded with a massive campaign of public preparedness, a blend of practical advice and propaganda. Across the nation, sirens were installed and bomb shelters were stocked. For an entire generation of school children, the fear of nuclear war became part of the daily curriculum. They were taught the absurd routine of duck and cover. In black and white films and instructional pamphlets, children were instructed that if they saw a sudden flash of light, they should immediately duck beneath their desks and cover their heads. It was a flimsy, futile gesture against a thermal blast, but it offered a comforting illusion of control. The images of the era told the story. Footage of massive mushroom clouds gave way to the unsettling sight of children hiding under desks, a stark, chilling contrast that defined the early Cold War. The United States was no longer safe. The terrifying power unleashed at Trinity was now pointed squarely back at the West.
The Soviet success in 1949 did not lead to détente. It led to desperate escalation. Washington demanded an answer to the sudden shift in power. That answer was the hydrogen bomb. This new weapon, based on nuclear fusion, was theorized to be exponentially more powerful, not just an advancement of the atomic bomb, but a leap into a new dimension of destructive force. Where the bomb dropped on Hiroshima had the power of 15 kilotons of TNT, the projected hydrogen bomb would be measured in megatons, thousands of times deadlier. Many scientists were horrified by this proposed leap toward ultimate annihilation. Chief among the opposition was J. Robert Oppenheimer. Haunted by the consequences of his first creation, he passionately opposed the development of the super, arguing it was militarily unnecessary and morally indefensible. He warned the government that such a weapon would push the world past the point of no return. But in the feverish climate of the Cold War, sanity was deemed treason. Oppenheimer's moral reservations, his past associations, and his outspoken opposition were seen as evidence of disloyalty. He was systematically silenced, stripped of his security clearance in a humiliating political maneuver, effectively ending his influence on American policy. The mantle of leadership for this new project passed to Edward Teller, the Hungarian-American physicist who aggressively championed the super program. Teller saw the H-bomb not as a moral dilemma, but as a scientific necessity for American survival. He would go on to be celebrated or condemned as the father of the hydrogen bomb. On November 1, 1952, the United States successfully detonated its first thermonuclear device, IV Mike, on the Inuiatak Atoll. The resulting explosion vaporized an entire island. The Soviets followed less than a year later. The race for power had abandoned all pretense of defense and devolved into a mad dash for maximum destruction. Science had become a weapon. Knowledge became fear.
By the mid-1950s, the atomic arms race had ceased to be a secret scientific endeavor. It had become a terrifying part of daily life. The Cold War was no longer abstract paranoia. It was a deep, pervasive cultural fear. The American public was saturated with images of their new reality. Chilling, black and white government test films depicting colossal mushroom clouds erupting over desolate Pacific atolls. This created the desperate, often futile trend of fallout shelters. From suburban backyards to school basements, families dug in, stocking canned goods and water, preparing for an attack they knew they couldn't truly survive. While citizens built these flimsy defenses, the superpowers were engaged in a reckless, exponential buildup. America and the Soviet Union raced to stockpile thousands of warheads, a destructive capacity far beyond anything needed to win a war. This was the dawn of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, a grim doctrine where survival rested on the guarantee that any first strike would be met with total retaliation, ensuring the annihilation of both nations. The scientific community, aghast at the monster they had created and the political chaos it fueled, issued a solemn warning to the world. In 1947, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists introduced the Doomsday Clock. It wasn't a literal timepiece, but a symbolic representation of how close humanity stood to global catastrophe. Moving the clock's hands closer to midnight served as a constant, stark reminder of the escalating nuclear peril. The shadow of the bomb had settled permanently over Earth. Humanity had learned to live under the constant, chilling threat of its own extinction. Every diplomatic crisis, every scientific advancement, every launch siren drill, all contributed to the agonizing, persistent rhythm of life under the cold glare of the nuclear age.
High tension, a pulsing heartbeat baseline begins, urgent and fast. The Cold War was a period punctuated by crises, but none brought humanity closer to the abyss than the events of October 1962. For 13 days, the world teetered on the very brink of nuclear annihilation. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis. The stage was set just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The Soviet Union, under the aggressive leadership of Nikita Khrushchev, had secretly deployed intermediate-range nuclear missiles to Cuba. Their target? The heartland of the United States. When American U-2 spy planes revealed the missile sites, President John F. Kennedy faced an impossible choice. The response was immediate, a naval blockade around Cuba. But beneath the public posturing, a frantic, desperate game of geopolitical poker unfolded. Secret negotiations were held, back channels were opened, and the leaders stared into the face of global catastrophe. American bombers armed with nuclear weapons were airborne, flying patrol patterns. Soviet submarines also carrying nuclear torpedoes were shadowed in the Caribbean. On the ground, in radar rooms across the globe, the air was thick with the chilling knowledge that a single miscalculation, a single rogue order could unleash hell. Every intercepted message, every blip on the screen carried the weight of the world's survival. The lines of communication between Washington and Moscow were strained to breaking point, yet it was through these fragile connections, through desperate phone calls between leaders and secret backroom deals, that the fate of billions was decided. The world held its breath. For those 13 terrifying days, the nuclear missiles were poised. The countdown to apocalypse seemed inevitable. But in the final, agonizing moments, both sides recoiled from the edge. A deal was struck. Soviet missiles would be withdrawn from Cuba, and in exchange, the U.S. secretly agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey and publicly pledged not to invade Cuba.
The near-death experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was a profound turning point. While leaders congratulated themselves on stepping back from the brink, the world saw only how close they had come to total annihilation. This realization triggered a massive wave of post-crisis disillusionment. If nuclear weapons were supposed to guarantee peace through strength, they had instead guaranteed perpetual terror. The age of deterrence began to feel like the age of despair. This despair found its voice in mass popular action, giving rise to powerful anti-nuclear protests across Europe and the United States. Ordinary citizens, terrified by the reckless policies of their governments, demanded an end to the arms race. Peace movements marched, carrying signs and symbols that warned against the unthinkable. But the cost of this endless arms race was not just political, it was profoundly human. Far from the political capitals, in remote corners of the globe, the evidence of nuclear carelessness emerged. Places like Bikini Atoll in the Pacific and the Nevada test site in the American West became real-life fallout zones.
The people living near these sites, the indigenous populations, the military personnel, and downwind residents, became the unacknowledged victims of progress. They suffered from radiation exposure, cancer, and birth defects, the grim, lingering consequences of atmospheric testing. The world began to see that the destructive fury of the bomb was not just an instantaneous blast, it was an invisible poison that persisted for generations. The public was confronted with the undeniable truth. The price of nuclear superiority was the health and safety of the planet itself. The promise of the atomic age had curdled into the reality of continuous peril. The world was forced to confront the moral stain left by the very progress it had once celebrated. The age of deterrence had become the age of despair.
The terrifying proximity of apocalypse in the 1960s ultimately forced the superpowers to pause. The lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis was simple. The path of endless escalation was suicidal. To survive, the bomb had to be controlled. The fear that once drove the arms race now drove the first cautious steps toward arms control. The result was a series of landmark nuclear treaties. First, the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which prohibited nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater, moving the terrifying spectacle of the mushroom cloud underground. More significantly, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, signed in 1968, committed non-nuclear states not to acquire nuclear weapons and obligated nuclear states to pursue disarmament. It was an imperfect agreement, but it represented a global acknowledgement that this ultimate power could not be allowed to spread unchecked. Behind these political maneuvers, the haunted men of the Manhattan Project continued their reflection. The original intent had been perverted by geopolitics. They voiced the core tragedy of their creation. We built it to end wars, not end the world. The immense energy they unlocked was a force for destruction, but it did not have to remain so. The final, enduring echo of atomic science lies in its potential for creation. The same fission process that incinerated cities can be harnessed and tamed. Across the globe, nuclear power shifted from a weapon of terror to a source of energy. Reactors and glowing cores now power sprawling cities, illuminating homes, factories, and hospitals, a silent testament to the vast energy released from the atom. The shadow of the nuclear bomb remains, but in the hum of every reactor, in every negotiated treaty, and in the sobriety learned from the brink, humanity continues its long, difficult attempt to balance the profound power of creation with the persistent danger of annihilation.
The decades of tension, the proxy wars, the countless crises, they all eventually faded. The Soviet Union dissolved, the walls came down, and the Cold War, that era of ideological and nuclear dread, was declared over. The geopolitical map changed, but the shadows remain. The technology born of a race for survival now exists as a permanent feature of our world. The bomb that silenced cities still whispers in our time, a warning that peace is not the absence of power, but the control of it. And so, the vigilance continues.